What happens when your worst fear becomes your reality? Hi, I'm Brent Cassidy. Welcome to the Nightmare Success In and Out podcast, where we explore how to overcome your fears and nightmares and set yourself free. We're going to be exploring this topic with guys I was in Leavenworth with and others who survived their own nightmare. These stories can be inspiring, sometimes sad. There's some humor, but hopefully you can come away with a nugget of something that'll help you knock down some of the prisons you built up in your own mind. All right, welcome back, Nightmare Success In and Out listeners. We're back. And this is where you all come for the stuff where what happens when your worst fear becomes your reality. How do you adapt, survive, overcome, set yourself free? Well, I got to tell you guys, when I started this show, there's certain people that you think, okay, I'd really like to have that guy on this show. And I'm on, 101, 102 interviews here. And Lewis and I were finally able to connect up. But Lewis L. Reed is, I kind of think that if you were talking about the justice reform movement, you'd be talking about a rock star in the movement. And what I mean by that is that we in this arena, this society that we're in, us that have gone to prison, there are people who are making things happen. And Lewis is one of those guys. He spent 14 years in federal prison. And when he got out, he did nothing but just take action. His leadership has led to the passage of more than 30 state and federal bills, including creating the biggest grassroots movement of the national, of creating an advocacy group for the First Step Act in 2018. Lewis has created a pathway to freedom for 650,000 plus people affected by the criminal justice system. He's consulted with the White House, Department of Justice, Fortune 100 corporations, state, federal agencies. You might have just seen Lewis last month on the cover of LA Weekly, and it was talking about who to follow, the top 5 entrepreneurs to follow. Lewis is also the producer of Hulu's Unprisoned series. If anybody's seen that, it's a great series. And of course, he's an author of the book, 9 Steps to Fall Up When You Trip Down. And I went on his website, and I love this quote from Lewis. I'm going to go ahead and give it to you because it's so good. Human potential is absolutely amazing. It can produce destiny out of disaster, miracles out of mistakes, purpose out of pain, and strength out of struggles. That's deep. That's good stuff. And it's stuff that Lewis is doing right now. I can't wait to jump into this interview. But before we do that, I want to recognize our show sponsor. Who likes spending a couple of weekends walking car lights, looking for a car. Then you spend 4 or 5 hours in the dealership to buy a car. It's kind of like a trip to the dentist. Well, there's a better way to take away all the pain and hassle of getting a car. It's called Auto Plaza Direct. They are your personal car concierge. Just tell them the car you want, what you can pay, and they'll go find that car for you. They'll negotiate your best price and deliver that car to you. They also offer you warranties and financing, full service. Go to autoplazadirect.com to get started with the personal car concierge, the new hassle-free way, the car buying experience you deserve. Auto Plaza Direct. Tell them Brent from Nightmare Success sent you. Lewis L. Reed, welcome to Nightmare Success. How are you doing, man?
My brother, it's good to be on with you, man. I am so looking forward to our conversation over the next few fleeting moments, but I'm certain that it's going to be transformative.
It is, and really, Lewis, the things that you've done since you've gotten out has been that way. I mean, I was on a call the other day, and it was with people who had been just impacted, and they were talking about the whole imposter syndrome. If I take this action, do I even deserve to be here? Am I supposed to be sitting around this table? And I think the reason why people like me get inspired of people like you is that you're like, Yeah. Yeah, I should be sitting around that table. Yeah, if I'm not sitting around that table, those are not going to be the decisions that need to be made. The only right decisions to be made are the people that have been affected by it. But it takes a lot of courage, to stand up and push your way through that and get into that round table.
I think that it takes even more courage, Brent, to sit down at a table, whether that's a literal and or figurative table. You talk about the things that I've done since I've been incarcerated, and while that stuff very well may have been impressive,
yeah,
I want to point back to the things that, in effect, weren't as illuminated.
Yeah.
Me having been spent 14 years in federal prison, what that experience was like for me. It's interesting. Just this Sunday past, I was at worship service, and the preacher was preaching about how there are good things that grow in the dark.
Mm.
And oftentimes, when you think about darkness, you don't necessarily think about things that can grow in darkness, because there is a degree of light that needs to shine in that darkness. But my words, not necessarily the preacher's words, one of the things that I've realized is that darkness is a precursor for light.
Yeah.
Not to proselytize any of our listeners, but when you think about Genesis, in the beginning, there was darkness. The darkness hovered over the face of the deep, and God spoke, and then there was light. When you think about the greatest, even when you think literally birth, mm-hmm. right? We're in a state of darkness in the womb of our mother, before we pass through the birth canal and we experience light on this side of life. And so while I was in darkness, the darkness in the womb of a prison cell, mm-hmm. or the crucible of a federal prison sentence, I was working on what that light was going to look like for me. I was working on my education. I was working on my emotional intelligence. I was working on my social IQ. I was looking around corners, and I was looking down the corridors of life, so to speak, even if it was a pinhole of light. So long as it was something that was shining into that darkness, that is what I was looking for.
You were looking for that.
Yeah. And so the closer that, the longer that I begin to walk, and the closer that I begin to walk towards that pinhole of light, it got larger and larger. And so what people are seeing on this side of life, on mm-hmm. this side of society, is in effect a maturation of what was already cooking in the oven.
I like so that.
On the other side.
Well,
and so, when we talk about imposter syndrome, and when we talk about, pushing past in order to be able to get in the rooms, people have been just as impacted. We have no compunction about pushing past things, right? We had to push past adversity in order to be able to get out.
Yep.
Now that we're home, now that we're out of the system, now it's a matter of, wait, my mind's playing tricks on me. Like the great philosopher, the Ghetto Boys, said in their 1992 song, yes, I am old enough to remember it, right? But the thing about it is that, in all actuality, what you're talking about at its core is trauma.
Mm-hmm.
It's the fear of being rejected, the fear of not being enough. You got more degrees than a thermometer. You can probably more arguably be the sharpest person in the room. But because you have this notion, this proverbial boogeyman, either in front of you, on the side of you, or in back of you, saying that because you have this conviction, this societal scarlet letter, you will never be enough, you start to buy into that notion that I guess I am not enough. I'm not enough to sit down at this table, mm-hmm. even though I have been invited to the room, even though I pressed past all of the adversities in order to get in this room, I may not necessarily be enough to be a contributor into this particular space.
Such a good point. And Glenn Martin, a couple of episodes ago, was talking about being invited by Obama to the White House. And he thought, I made it. This is my moment, going into the Oval Office. He gets pulled aside told to sit down, and it all of a sudden starts feeling like prison. You know, he's singled out, not told anything, is what happens in prison. They don't tell you anything in prison. They just, you find out what the next step is. So he sits there, and he's the guy that's invited. He's the guy that's supposed to speak. And he waits, and the Secret Service person sits there, and finally this young intern comes out, and she says, "Oh, Mr. Jones," she said, I'm so sorry you had to wait, and please come with me. And so when they get, he said, "I'm not Mr. Jones, I'm Mr. Martin. I'm supposed to be meeting with the president." And this intern was able to take him to where he was supposed to be, but he was singled out because of his conviction.
Yep.
And, you know, he wrote a letter after that, and it made it into the Wall Street Journal. And actually, I give a lot of credit to President Obama making a phone call back to Glenn and say, "Hey, listen, that was really bad. You know, I invited you here. The protocol was something I didn't know. I've changed the protocol." But it was such a moment in time of what really happens, you know, that this is a lifetime thing. And talking about a lifetime thing, Louis, your story is so interesting because what really caught me, you know, going and doing the research on you is that one of the things you talk about is, I'm not sure about second chance. I'm not sure about that word, because what if I didn't get a first chance? What if I just want a fair chance? And can you kind of let us into your childhood and growing up? Because it wasn't easy. It was one of those things that you really had to work through. And I mean, you're where you're at now because of who you are now. But give us some insight into growing up as Louis L. Reed.
Yeah, well, before I do that, I do want to preamble what my life experience has been with this notion. You can't enumerate grace, right? When we're talking about a second chance, that's decoded to say that this person needs grace.
Right.
And so you can't quantify what grace is.
Right.
I'm certain that there's people who are listening to this who very well may be watching us. And if you look back over the last 24 hours of your life, there was a degree of grace that was probably immeasurable that you were in operation through. We all need grace.
Yeah.
And so when I'm talking about moving away from this notion of second chance, I'm actually talking about pivoting us to reimagine what a fair chance may look like, right? So when you say a second chance, to me, that means that there was a first opportunity that I had. You may say, well, you were the one who committed the crime. You were the one who did this. So you had just as much of an opportunity as everyone else. Did I? Really? Right? When you look at where I grew up at, segueing into my experience, both my parents were incarcerated when I'm 5 years old. They do federal prison time. When my parents come home, when I'm approximately 10 years old, I'm raised by my maternal grandmother. Here is the intersection of crack cocaine, hip hop, and my mother being released to a world that looked starkly different than what it did five years prior. And so not only did my mother's life become diminished by a federal prison sentence, but here it is, it's also diminished by substance abuse as well. I am 13 years old. My sister is shot in her face. She loses her eye by her then boyfriend, who she subsequently has a child by approximately two to 3 years later. When I'm 14 years old, I get shot in my chest, critically injured, where I had to relearn how to walk again over a $3 crack cocaine drug deal by a guy who at the time was 25 years old. When I was 15 years old, my good friend of mine, who was relatively some years older than me, he was shot 6 times in his face and head, approximately 7 feet away from where I was. But the story doesn't stop there. The saga continues. When I'm 16 years old, my first cousin, who happened to be 16 himself, is shot and killed. 32 times he was shot in front of his mother because he was dancing in a party with some girl whose boyfriend was jealous that happened. But the saga continues. And so in between the age of approximately 16 to 21, 22 years old, deeply involved in criminal enterprises, trafficking heroin, trafficking crack cocaine, involved in various elements of the street. And then when I am approximately 21 years old, I participate in a drive-by shooting over a robbery. Someone stuck me up, where in that shooting, I inadvertently shot a then 5-year-old child in the attempt to harm the person who stuck me up. And so when you think about the chance that I had before there was this palatable term called the school to prison pipeline, what exposure, what starting point for success did someone like Lewis have when he was 5 years old? What did it do to my psyche, to my fragile naivete at the age of 5 years old, where I begin to look at the system with a degree of distrust, where I begin to look at police officers and social workers as the enemy, because every time they showed up in our neighborhood,
it was the wrong thing.
Taking one away.
Lewis,
right?
I want to break up that a little bit, because I think there's such a powerful thing that happens when you're shot. And I think can't remember what age you are, and your dad throws you in the car and you're rushing to the hospital, and they pull your dad over because he's speeding. And this is something I don't think people understand about probation and how people are thrown back into the system because normal life happens.
Mm-hmm.
He's literally trying to get his kid to the hospital, his son who's been shot. He's worried that you're going to not make it. He gets pulled over, and because he's on probation and because he's speeding, he's taken into custody and thrown back into the system.
Yeah. And thereby further reinforcing that degree of distrust,
to you,
right, that I have with the system.
Right.
It further reinforces this notion about us against them, survival of the fittest.
Right.
Here it is, I'm dealing with the trauma of having been critically injured, life literally hanging in the balance, and my dad is remanded into custody because he's under supervision at that time. And so back to this notion about grace, and back to this notion about second chance, and back to this notion about fair chance. Fair chance, in all actuality, is grace disguised in the opportunity for people who have been locked out of a system, locked out of systems, locked out of opportunities, to be able to unlock that door and allow them to go. Look, we're not saying that they need an easy pass, right? We're not saying that we want them to stop at the toll. We want them to be able to pay the appropriate fare, but that fare should not be excessive. That fare should not be a tax beyond anybody else who's in society, simply because they have a registration that very well may come in the likeness of a Department of Correction and or a Federal Bureau of Prisons registration number.
So, Lewis, when you went through all those years of trauma and seeing things happen as they happen because you were born into that experience, when you're sentenced and your nightmare happens that you're going into the federal system, what are you thinking? What is your world thinking in your mind at that age?
Yeah. And so, quite frankly, I was facing maximum of 80 years total in the state and federal. And at that time, my future was very bleak. I didn't know how I was going to do the amount of time that was levied in theory against me. I knew that I did not want to lose my grandmother while I was incarcerated.
Yeah.
I knew that if something happened to her, I was more than likely going to commit suicide, because I just could not imagine a world where I had experienced my grandmother for 20 plus
Who had taken
short
care
shop.
of you? Yeah.
Yeah, she took care of me, right? And so when I think about it, at that time, I couldn't see my way clear. It's almost like having those beer glasses on.
Yeah. I've
The
seen them.
game,
Yeah.
the beer glasses. You
Yeah.
try to walk, right? There's nothing clear. There's no clarity. There's no crystallization. But you try to play the game anyway.
Right.
And so my equilibrium was off. I didn't know how I was going to do it, but I did know one of two things. Number one, I knew that my faith in God was growing. And last I checked, my Bible told me that all things happen for the good of those who love God and are called according to his purpose. I had developed a relationship. I was growing a relationship with God while I was incarcerated. And I knew I had purpose. I had a sneaking suspicion that I had purpose. I didn't know what it was, but I knew that I had purpose. That's the first thing. The second thing is that I had the unwavering support of family and friends.
That's big. I mean, that's big, Lewis, at that time to be, because you were looking at what, 16 years?
60. Yeah, I got sentenced ultimately to 16 years.
Right.
Federal prison, but I was facing a maximum of approximately 80 years. I should say.
Yeah, and it's when you get into the federal system, that can be really scary on how they stack charges because you and I are on different sides of the. You were in your world and I was in my world. Mine was a business world, so in my business world, they could just stack. Okay, you've been in business for 30 years, so we can go every time you put something in the mail, every time you wired something, and then anything you ever did because this is deemed to be wrong is money laundering.
Yep.
So when I was looking at going to trial, I was looking at 940 years. Yeah. So in the federal system, they can do and stack and create anything that they to push you to the point, and that's why you have the 97% in the federal system that those indicted are pleading and going that way.
Brent, I just want to underscore a point that you're making. 97%. You said 97%.
Right.
Do you realize that Michael Jordan, the greatest basketball player of all time, and Kobe Bryant, who arguably probably is the second greatest basketball player of all time, did not have a combined shooting percentage of 97%?
Oh, God, no.
They didn't have a combined win percentage of 97%.
Of course not.
So when you're talking about 97%, a 97% win rate is in effect unheard of unless there is something that is being stacked.
Right. Great point. You don't want to. I've said this more times than I should have, but I had one of my guests on here said that going against the federal government is like your beer softball league getting to play the LA Dodgers. It's just not going to end up good.
I'm going to have to use that. I hope it's not copyrighted.
Well, I also, Lewis, you and I were talking before we got on, but one of the greatest speeches that I think, because I follow this stuff and get inspired by different pieces. You gave one of the greatest, I think, analogies in your TED Talk of, and I think it's called, is it called Trapdoors?
Big Trapdoor.
Yeah, the big trapdoor. Yeah, shattering the big trapdoor. Man, what a great analogy, because you I don't want to give away what you take, and everybody can go to that, but it was all about the fact that somebody falls down when they're starting their race, and the whole stadium, when that person falls down and that person gets back up and they start the race back again, not giving up, everybody's behind them. Everybody's like, wow, that person's, they got grit, they've got potential, they don't give up, they're everything. And then you give that analogy back to, let's talk about the race of life of that person that starts at the starting line and they fall down. But the difference is that they have to go back to the starting line to start the race over. And then when they start in their lane, all of a sudden these trap doors start opening and they can't see when they're going to trap and fall in. And what does the audience think of that? And I think it's one of the greatest analogies of the system of how do you get past all that. But I want to go back to where you are as a 21, 22-year-old. You're going into a federal system.
Mm-hmm.
You've got a lot of time. What is the young Lewis thinking going into the federal system?
I think I have youthful arrogance. I had never been in a controlled environment as such, never been on a structure as such. And so I had a hard time with authority. I think that if you were going to code this from a psychological perspective, you would probably say that I had oppositional defiance disorder.
Yeah.
You will come up with a disorder for everything. But I had youthful arrogance. And I can tell you that for the first 5 years or so, my time in federal prison was topsy-turvy. I was in and out of solitary confinement. I was, racketeering while I was incarcerated.
Mm-hmm.
And it was around year 6. Brent, I never forget this. There was a guy who was doing time who had got sentenced to about 30 years. And this guy was the resident preacher of the sort.
Yeah.
And I remember I used to be fascinated by the way that he could articulate a message, not even from a spiritual perspective, but just from a grammatically profound a way. And I remember, he, for whatever reason, he had taken a liking to me. And one day we were out in the yard. And for our listening audience, when you're on the yard, that is the equivalent if you are in your workplace of congregating in the break room. Or
that's a good point.
You are, yeah, it's a place
for those listening down the Cayman Islands. This is where you gather.
yeah. This is where you socialize and gather. So we're on the yard, and I'm socializing and fraternizing with the Connecticut folks. And I remember the guy walked right up to me, and he said, "Canali," that's what they call me. He said, "Canali, let me talk to you." And
why'd they call you that, Lewis?
That was my street name.
Okay.
Yeah, I got named after that by this guy who he wore suits, and he's like, "Man, you smooth." He said,
"You're like Canali."
Yeah, he's like, "You just remind me of like one of my suits, man." He's like, "You're young, but you're sharp. You're smooth."
Okay, so that's a good nickname. That's a good prison nickname.
Yeah. So he walks up to me. He's like, "Look," he's like, "How long are you going to keep wasting your potential?" I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "I walk by you every day. I see you have a version of the same conversations with the same people, recycling the same stories." And he said, "You're anchored in your history and you're not focused on your destiny." And I can tell you, it was almost like a convergence of like spirituality, like this intellectual door opening up in my mind. Also, on or around the same time, incidentally, I had a conversation with John Gotti Jr.
Okay.
Who I was incarcerated.
Wow.
He and we happened to be walking the track. And when we would walk the track, he would always walk the track counterclockwise. No, I'm sorry. I would walk the track counterclockwise. After I had that conversation with the guy, his name was Herb. I would walk the track counterclockwise. And one day he walked up to me. He said, "Hey, Canali." He's like, "Hey, let me ask you a question." He said, "How come you walk the track counterclockwise?" And I said, "I'm training myself." He said, "Training yourself how?" He said, I told him, I said, "I'm training myself so that I can go against the grain when I get home."
I like that.
But then he said, "What are you going against the grain doing?"
What do you do?
And he said, he started interrogating me. He said, "What are you going to do?" Right? And he said, "Let me ask you a question." He said, "When you came in," he said, "How much money did you have?" And I told him I had a few $100,000. He said, "Who took it?" I said, "The feds." He said, "You had any properties?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "That was smart." He said, "Who took it?" I said, "The feds." He said, "You had a few girlfriends?" I said, "Yeah, I had a few girlfriends." He said, "Who took them?" I said, "The feds didn't take them." He was like, He said, "But the feds take them away." I said, "Yeah, that's true." He said, "You know the one thing that the brothers never realized?" I said, "What's that?" He said, "The one thing the feds can never take from you is an education." And this is shortly after I had this conversation with Herb, Brother
Yeah.
Herb at the time.
You're getting double
And I'm
hit.
like, this is, you know, we're cooking with Crisco right now.
Exactly.
And it was one of those moments where the combination of that, this, and the third.
Was it a switch? I mean, was it total a switch that went on?
Yeah, there was a switch. It was a recalibration. And I remember kind of like trying to go back out to the yard.
Yeah.
And people having a version of the same conversations that they were having over the last 5 years. And I said, no, I don't need to be focused.
You're looking at it differently, right?
I started looking at it differently, and that was my transformation.
That's so interesting, Lewis, because it's so. I hear those stories, and it's so fascinating when that happens, because in a place like the yard, to think that those two things happened for someone who's kind of looking out for you and sees promise in you and sees potential in you, that's one thing. But the other thing is you have to believe it, that they are saying it to you, and that you have to grab onto it.
Yeah.
And so what do you do after that?
After that, it was a quest. It was a quest for education. It was a quest to distance myself from the monotony. I worked in Unicor.
Yeah.
Unicor is the federal prisons industry. That is the most premium job that you can have when you are incarcerated on a federal level. I worked myself up from a quality assurance inspector to being the administrative clerk for the associate warden. There was a person who gave me an opportunity, who bet on me, who was somebody else who was incarcerated, who was my mentor. Not only just my spiritual mentor, but my work mentor as well, who in effect co-signed for me to the quality assurance manager at the time. Her name was Mary Valley, who took a gamble on me for me to be her clerk. And then I continued to just elevate in my Unicor career there. I worked payroll, I worked quality assurance.
Unicor is a big deal. I mean, there's a lot of people that work there.
When I came home with almost 10 grand.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a factory of, it's a private and government owned situation where they bring all this stuff in, and it's all taken apart and sold off, I guess is what they eventually do to it. But it comes out of all these federal buildings, and from furniture to computers to TVs to everything you can imagine.
Even some of the telephone cases or the electronic cases that you may get, the packaging that's produced in Unicor.
But the other good thing about Unicor is it was a good place to see first run movies, because whoever was running Unicor could always figure out how to beat the system and get down to Saturday night so you can see a first run movie. And I never understood how they could do that in Unicor, but it was always figured out.
Yeah, very true. Very true.
So Lewis, you basically start building a new life for yourself in prison.
Yeah. Yep.
Was it because you hang with, your car in prison, and you hang with certain people in prison? Was it hard to break away from these guys that you were with, and oh my God, Lewis, what's he doing?
Not at all. Not at all. I've always been one of those people where I kind of like did things my own way, and I've been a leader in my own right. And while I enjoyed the fraternization that I had with the people who were from Connecticut, ultimately, when I embarked on my, journey for education, and when I wanted to grow spiritually, those folks had no compunction. Like, I still was who I was, right? Like, my personality was still the same.
Yeah.
I didn't necessarily kind of like distance myself from them, so to speak, but they knew that I was focused in a different way. I just had I had a different focus.
Were you connected to the outside? Like, were your family, your friends? Did you have that connection?
Yeah, I saw my family. I saw my children.
That's a big deal. Yeah.
Yeah, every other week, while I was incarcerated, my family would come up, whether it was, sister, cousin, children, etc. I would see them every other week the entire time that I was incarcerated.
And Louis, I think that's one of the bigger things, because I too had that. I have 3 daughters and my wife, and she's the one that should wear the cape and the superhero outfit, because she came every weekend, and she wanted the other kids that she would bring because they were in college and they were passing through, and she'd pick one of them up. Being able to, I think, to stay plugged into the outside makes it, I don't think I was going to throw out the word easier. I think it makes it more functional for you to go out to the outside, because you're not, because I think that what happens is, and it happens to a lot of people, and one of the sad things that happens in prison, you see people who lose everything. They not only lose what they have, but they lose their family. And so they become further and further removed from the outside.
And in that further removal from the outside, they become more institutionalized.
Right.
They become transformed by what their environment is dictating. And so they lose themselves. You don't only lose your freedom, but you lose a sense of identity.
Yep.
The further you get away from society. Hence the reason why that familial contact and connection is so integral to successful reentry.
Well, and Louis, when you mention institutionalized, I mean, you can see something crazy happen where a guy is 5 months out to the door and he puts hands on a guard. And the reason why he does it is because he's so comfortable in his ugly routine of being in prison that he's afraid of freedom because he's so far removed from it.
Yeah, it's one of those things where dysfunctional becomes functional and functional becomes dysfunctional.
Yep.
It's a version of like Stockholm syndrome.
Yep.
Where you just kind of like want to not leave the safety of what it is that you have been conditioned. Yeah. Hey, Brent, just as an FYI, slight programming note, I don't have my charger with me, and my computer is only on 10%.
Okay.
So, we're probably going to have to power through this a little bit faster.
All right, we'll power through. This is one of the first times I've had to do that. So we've got 10% to work on.
Yeah.
All right. So let's get to you getting close to the door. Yeah. What are you thinking, Louis? What are you thinking after you've been in? Like, am I thinking I'm going out there to conquer the world, or good God, how am I getting out there?
Yeah. So here's the thing. I lost my nephew 6 months prior to me being released from federal prison. And so everything that I had developed, everything that I had learned, everything that I had worked on up to that point was a test. It was a test. It was the darkest period, arguably, of my life, if not my incarceration. And I slipped into a depression. And it wasn't until, approximately, 3 months prior to me being released from incarceration that I was able to kind of like recalibrate. And so, I'm looking forward to the plan, my plan of action. What was my plan of action? I knew that I wanted to do human services. I knew that I wanted to be able to give back and help people who were transitioning out of the space that I was currently in.
Mm-hmm.
And so I began to think about what my plan was going to be. Everything that I had worked on up to that moment, I wanted to be able to execute with surgical precision when I was released from incarceration.
Which is pretty amazing, because that's exactly what you did. You got out and started taking action on your plan pretty much immediately. I mean, you did some incredible stuff that people don't do in Connecticut immediately.
Yeah, look, one of the things, the abridged version of it is that I was released from a federal prison, springboarded my career in human services as a case manager. I went on to be the program manager for Connecticut's largest permanent supportive housing program. From there, my career elevated where I convinced the largest city in the state of Connecticut that they needed a government office for reentry affairs. I was in that position for about 2.5 years. We replicated the model throughout the country in other major cities: Kansas City, Los Angeles, Chicago, Detroit, LA, New York, etc. Won an award by the U.S. Conference of Mayors for best reentry practices. And then I was rearrested in part for child support arrears that accrued while I was incarcerated.
Right.
Slipped into a clinical depression through Glenn Martin. This is the first time I'm talking about this publicly. Through Glenn Martin, he introduced me to
Just
Dan
Leadership.
Jones.
Yeah. Van
Yeah.
Jones?
Well, I was introduced to Just Leadership prior to conceptualizing the the mayor's office for reentry
Yep.
affairs.
Okay.
Actually, it was my introduction into Just Leadership that helped me refine that proposal
Which is
even
great
more.
because it's connecting the dots. Because for those playing the board game at home, Glenn was on a couple of weeks ago, and here we are.
Yeah, and incidentally, I had been exposed to Glenn prior to my release from federal incarceration. The person who ultimately became the director of the BOP, Bureau of Prisons, Director Samuels, he came into the institution, played a video of this guy called, by the name of Glenn Martin, who at the time was vice president at Fortune Society, and he talked about this notion about those closest to the problem being closest to the
Love that
solution,
quote.
furthest from resources and power.
Yep.
And I said to myself, like, I want to be like this guy.
Mm-hmm.
This guy is going to be my North Star. And so Glenn introduced me to Van Jones and Jessica Jackson over at Cut 50.
Yep.
I went on to be the national organizer. We got this bill called the First Step Act across the finish line, which to date has released more than 30,000 people from federal prison. We went on to pass, 10 to 12 other state versions of that bill. And then when Cut 50 was folded into an outfit called Dream.org, I went over to Reform Alliance, which is co-founded by Jay-Z. Van Jones is the founding CEO there, where I was a senior executive at that organization as well.
Which is just incredible. And Candia Milton's going to be on here next week. So it's how all these things.
Oh, look at how you're threading the family together, man.
But it's what's so great about it is that each one of you have been such a thread, because you can't do it with one person. There's 28 million ex-felons out there, and the problem with the ex-felon world is that they don't push themselves into one voice. And people like you, and people like Candia, and people like Glenn Martin are helping do that. I wonder, because I don't want your battery to run out, Louis. But
yeah, I'm on 5 now.
As it was happening,
mm-hmm.
Did you feel like? What did you feel like?
I'll tell you this. If you watch the movie of The First Step, that's on Amazon right now. You can download it on Amazon Prime. You'll see that, yes, we were able to get that bill across the finish line. Yes, I've been able to do a lot of other significant things. But I had never maximized the moment. That's that imposter syndrome. That's that fear of not measuring up. I never took the time to maximize one thing at a time. I went from this thing to that thing to that thing to that thing until ultimately last year I had to check myself into a residential mental health facility, because I discovered in the death of my father, and my father was assaulted and murdered in 2021, and my sister passed a year to the day that my father passed away from a coronavirus exacerbated by asthma. And when I felt like everything was crashing down on me, in that I lost even, a child that I had fathered, that I was estranged from. And so I can tell you, Brent, it wasn't until all of those things came crashing down where my heart felt like I could not lift the weight off of me, that I checked myself into a mental health facility, a residential mental health facility. While I was there, realized that I was not only grieving my father, I was not only grieving the loss of my mother when I was 5 years old. I wasn't just grieving the loss of innocence, having been shot when I was 14, but I was also grieving the loss of my freedom.
Yeah.
That I had never properly had a cathartic experience through, because I came home and it was go, 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 go.
All the time. Go. Yep.
All the time. And so now I'm on 3%. But now what I realize is that I have to be able to maximize the moment.
Yeah. Be present. And I want to, before you go to 3% to 2%, I want to ask you, Louis, because you have accomplished so much and you've been through so much. What do you think is your biggest takeaway from where you've been to where you are now?
Where I'm going. Not just to where I am now, where I'm going. One thing that is replete in my life is that grace, God's grace, is sufficient. And I've realized that God's strength has been made absolutely perfect in my weakness.
Mm.
And so the times in my life where I couldn't press through, when I couldn't press on, when I couldn't get up, and it felt like I just wanted to lay down, it was God's strength. It reminds me of the poem Footprints, where this person gets to heaven, and when the account of his life rolls, there are two sets of footprints on the sand, and those two sets of footprints are indicative of the highlights in that individual's life: when they got married, when they had their first child, when they bought their first house.
Mm.
But the times in that person's life when they got divorced, where they lost a child, where they lost a parent, where they lost a job, there's only one set of footprints in the sand, and the person becomes incensed, and he said, God, you said that you would be there with me every step of the way, and I only see one set of footprints during the hardest times in my life. And God responds to him, it's because when you didn't have strength to walk, it was me who was carrying you.
Mm.
And so for me, it's that grace that has been replete to get me from the age of 5 years old to where I am now.
That's powerful. That's good stuff. That's a good place to end it, because you're only at 2%, Lewis.
Yeah, one now.
Hey, man, you are, and when I said you're a rock star in the movement, there's a lot of us are here, part of this movement, that look up to you, and you just keep it going, man, because you should be proud of what you've done, proud of what you've been, and what you're going to go do. And we're with you. And that's part of why this is so important.
Hey, we're all with each other, man.
Yep.
It's not about the it's about the we.
Yep.
And quite frankly, we're all walking each other home.
Yep.
And I want to be as good as to you as I can be, on our way home, on our way to the other side of life. Appreciate you, bro.
Good stuff, Lewis, man. Appreciate it. Hey, for all of you that are looking for a book out there, I wrote one. It's called Nightmare Success. Check it out. It's good reading if you like to read. I don't have an audio book yet, but I'm going to do that. Hey, if you want to go check me out and what's going on, it's BrentCassidy.com. Guys, I love the follows. Share the show if you get anything out of it. Share the show. And the reviews have been coming in. I so much appreciate that, guys. It's such a big deal because it really helps grow the show. As I used to say to my people when I was writing my emails back and forth from Leavenworth, stay strong. I'll do the same. Nightmare Success. Lewis Reed, thanks so much today. Nightmare Success, in and out.